Hello YouTube and welcome back to another book review from me, your host Logan Albright. Today I'm continuing my exploration of the Gothic literature genre. Went right back to the beginning and I enjoyed Melmoth the Wanderer so much that I decided to try the novel that started off the entire Gothic genre. It's called The Castle of Otronto by Horace Walpole, one of the only real works of fiction that he wrote. He was reportedly inspired by a dream that he had, or a nightmare rather, what made him want to write it. And it's also kind of inspired by this neo-Gothic house that he had living in, this mansion called Strawberry House, which is still available as a tourist attraction in England. So it's sort of the starting point where this whole tradition of Gothic fiction, Gothic romances came from. And it's got a lot of the tropes that would later become famous. It's a lot shorter than I expected it to be. Usually novels written in the 18th century are long and boring. This is very short. It's written in let me look it up, 1764, yes, so quite early. I don't read too many novels from much earlier than that. So I was anticipating it to be a little bit of a difficult read, but it actually wasn't very much of a difficult read at all. I quite enjoyed it. Like I said, it's very short. This edition is only 100 pages, and I really had a lot of fun with it. But before I get into it, let's talk about the edition I have. It is another print-on-demand edition, just like my Melmoth the Wanderer was. And I don't have any issue with print on demand as a concept. I think it's kind of great for preserving classic works of literature, but it just seems like you're not able to find like really professionally published editions of a lot of these older works anymore. So it's good that they are keeping them alive. I just wish that there was a little bit more quality control over them. There's nothing on the spine, so if I put this on my shelf, I won't know what it is unless I pull it out. There's nothing on the back cover. There's no notes. There's no introduction. There's no context. All the context I had for this, I had to look up independently online. So that's kind of a bummer, but at least I got the text, and I am very much an advocate of physical media. So I like to have a physical book that I can read instead of just a Kindle file or a PDF or something. So anyway, Castle of Otronto is a very simple story, and it's almost fairy tale-like. It reminds me a lot of the Brothers Grimm sort of approach to storytelling, because a lot of weird stuff happens, and it's got kind of this, once upon a time there was this castle, and there was a prince who lived in the castle, and he had his wife who was the princess. They had a beautiful daughter. They had a son who they weren't so crazy about, and the prince wants to marry off his son to this neighboring kingdom, so he brings over this woman Isabella to marry his son. But just as his son is about to get married, a giant helmet falls out of the sky and crushes him in the courtyard. And there's an ancient prophecy that threatens the prince's legitimacy to the Castle of Otronto, and he's freaked out by that. So that's kind of what kickstarts the entire action of the novel. And then a bunch of crazy stuff happens. It's got all the Gothic tropes that you would hope to find in a work like this. It's got haunted paintings, ghosts, paintings that talk, kind of like in Harry Potter. It's got a statue that's got blood dripping from the nose. It's got hermits living in caves out in the wilderness. It's got a secret passage to a neighboring monastery. It's got secret identities and miscommunicated identities. It's got, what else does it have? All kinds of stuff like that. Just like prophecies of doom. All these kind of Gothic things, spooky, scary noises that go bump in the night. And it all takes place in this sort of ruin of a castle with this angry prince who's kind of a tyrant ruling over his family. And then it's very melodramatic. The novel was sort of criticized and has continued to be criticized for being overly melodramatic and silly, which it is. It reminds me also, in addition to a Grimm's fairy tale, it reminds me a lot of like a Gilbert and Sullivan opera, although without the comedy, because there's a lot of like, oh, it turns out that this person is really royalty and we thought they were just a peasant. There's a lot of like mistaken identities. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of miscommunication, some kind of a Shakespearean miscommunication on the along the lines of like Romeo and Juliet or something. That sort of stuff happens a lot. So it's drawn from that school of melodrama where there's plot twists around every corner and nothing is as it seems, and it's just kind of like sensational. But I quite enjoyed it and thought it was a lot of fun to read. So an interesting thing to note about it is that Walpole wrote it as a apparent translation of a medieval text. He said, oh, I found this medieval text and I translated it. And, this is a classic device that authors have used forever. And but he kind of got away with it for a little while. And people thought that it was a medieval manuscript, and they heavily praised it. They said, this is an amazing medieval manuscript that you found. It's so great. We love it. It's an amazing story. And then it came out that he really wrote it, and the critics turned on it immediately. And they said, no, this is actually garbage. How could you write such a bad thing? And it's written in a little bit archaic English, even for the 18th century, to try to bolster the idea that it's older than it really is. But I think that's really interesting because I've been talking on this channel a little bit about the context of different types of novels and like, is a good novel regardless of when it was published, or is it like something that was good in the Victorian period no longer good because audiences have changed? And I'm of the opinion that good literature is good literature and it doesn't really matter when it comes from. But I've heard people say, well, yeah, that novel that by Charles Dickens was great, but you could never write a novel like that now. And I'm like, why not? If it was great, it should be great now. I don't see the problem. But that seems to be the attitude that a lot of people have. And so that seems to be the attitude that the critics of Horace Walpole had when the Castle of Otronto was published. They thought, if this was written 500 years ago, then it's great. But if it's written today, it's garbage. And I think that's an odd reaction to literature, but it seems like one that a lot of people have. So I'd be interested to know what you guys think about that in the comments. Like, do you think that it matters when something was written? Should it stand on its own legs regardless of the context of when it was published, or does the context really matter, and is it integral to understanding it and to appreciating it as whether it's good or not? I don't really think it matters. So what else to say about the Castle of Otranto? Like I said, very short, so there's not a ton to talk about it, but the backstory of it is really interesting, and it inspired very many imitators. And so the next book, I won't get to it immediately. I have a couple other books to review before I get to it. But the next book that I've ordered to explore this is a direct response to this novel called The Old English Baron, which was written as a way of kind of taking some of the good parts of the book and putting them in a slightly more serious, less melodramatic context. So we'll see if that's interesting or not. I'm kind of expecting it to be less interesting to me because I like all the over-the-top elements. And like, I really loved Matthew Lewis as the monk, and the monk is described by critics as like so over the top and extreme with these Gothic tropes that it might as well be parody. And I really like the monk. I don't think it's parody. I think it's awesome. So I kind of like those more extreme things. So we'll see. The Old English Baron might be a little staid and boring for my taste, but that's what I'm planning on reading next to continue this. And then I'm going to read some Anne Radcliffe. I've read one Anne Radcliffe. I want to read some more. And there's a lot of other, there's a couple of early vampire novels I think I'm going to check out too before Dracula. I want to read those. So that'll be fun. But this novel does have that sort of a little bit of that medieval flavor, which is cool, and that's kind of what lends to the Gothic atmosphere. It's like a little bit Beowulf, but more so like some of those medieval Arthurian sagas or some of the Norse sagas, where protecting the bloodline of the family is really important, and who you marry is really important, and like those kind of concerns that this medieval nobility and royalty had is something that features a lot. So I mean, I detect a lot of influences in this book that I find interesting. There's Shakespeare, there's stage melodrama, there's Beowulf, there's medieval romances, and yet it's considered to be such a unique and singular work that it inspired an entire genre that stretches even today in terms of Gothic subculture and continued explorations of the Gothic genre in fiction, in television, in movies. It's all kind of there. So while this isn't as over the top as something like The Monk, and it isn't as drenched in like that Gothic imagery as something like Melmoth the Wanderer, the seeds to all that is here, and I thought it was fun. So one of my commenters said that he thought I would not enjoy the Castle of Otranto because it wasn't very good, but I actually enjoyed it a lot. It's not, you might not call it great literature, but it's really interesting literature, and it's a lot of fun to read, and I was invested in the story. I was invested in what happens to all the characters and the payoffs. There's a lot of there are flaws in it. There's a lot of overly flowery melodramatic speeches that the characters launch into that I could have done without. And then there's a couple little things that kind of show up as portents that don't really pay off very well. For example, the gigantic helm that drops and kills the sun is not especially well explained by the end of the story. There is an explanation for it, but it's not very well explained, which, in those older works from the medieval period or before, things weren't always tied up very neatly. They were much more free-form and organic, and those kind of fairy tale logic where not everything has to be, it's a folk tradition. It's an oral tradition, right? And so things don't get as neatly packaged as they are when you're a singular writer trying to sculpt everything and design everything in your novel just the way you want it to be. But I thought it was thoroughly enjoyable. I liked it a lot. So that's what I have to say about the Castle of Otronto. Really interesting to see where the Gothic genre began, and I'm really interested to trace it and see where it continues to go. In the meantime, I will have other books to review, so if you are not a fan of the Gothic, don't despair, don't leave the channel, don't unsubscribe. There will be other stuff for you coming up really soon in a variety of different genres. I'm going to do some more fantasy, I'm going to do some more science fiction. I'm reading some Dickens right now. That's going to come into play if I can ever finish it. It's a long book. But there'll be plenty of other things to explore apart from Gothic. So stick around, subscribe to the channel, like the video, click the bell for notifications, and please leave me comments down below because I love to read your comments. Your comments are so wonderful. They're the highlight of my day. Thank you for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I will catch you next time.